In the introductory lecture about civil aviation, I had mentioned that one of the features of modern civil aviation is that it is highly deregulated and privatized. Now, this did not come about right from the beginning. This was an act created by the US Senate called as the Airline Deregulation Act, which came into being in 1978. And that particular act actually created a lot of disruption and transformation in the civil aviation sector worldwide. So, it is important for us to have a look at the nuances of the Airline Deregulation Act, which is what is the purpose of this particular lecture. First of all, what is meant by deregulation? If you look at the dictionary, deregulation is a noun which is defined as the act or process of removing restrictions and regulations to allow something to proceed without much restrictions. Now, in civil aviation, you cannot remove all the regulations because that will directly affect the safety, reliability and efficiency. So, some regulations definitely are needed, but restrictions which were leading to a decline in the industry or very high prices or certain practices which were predatory, those can be taken care and were taken care by the deregulation. So, the Airline Deregulation Act 1978, which we will call as ADA, we need to understand what is ADA, who passed it, what are the consequences of that. There are some positive impacts, there are some negative impacts. So, let us look at them. 1925 was the first litigation, or not litigation, but first instance where the government in the US came up with an act called as a Kelly Act, in which to encourage air transportation, they allowed private airlines to carry air mail. Before that, mail was only through surface transportation. The aim of this particular activity was to encourage civil aviation, so that the spare capacity of an aircraft can be used by an airline to transport mail and earn money. So, in 1930 an Air Mail Act was enacted, and the postmaster was given complete authority in deciding all aspects related to the transport of air mail. So, obviously, when you have authoritarian regimes, then you have issues, and 3 years later there was a scandal in which the postmaster had exceeded the authority and given blatant favors to one particular airline, and because of that people realized that too much authority vested in one agency can lead to negative consequences. So, this is called as a spoils conference, and then in the late 30s the power was transmitted to the Civil Aviation Board, or CAB. Now, what is CAB? CAB basically came into being in 1938, but it was dismantled in 1985. CAB essentially had the control on the airfares. They decided how much fare an airline can charge on a particular route. They also determined the routes and made them available to individual airlines. Because of this, there was a limitation on the entry of the new airlines. They also allotted the air mail. Instead of one postmaster or the individual having authority, the board was created to allow distribution of permissions for air mail, and they insisted on particular routes. Many of the CAB norms were to ensure that there are flights on one particular routes, so that airlines do not stick to only very lucrative routes. In fact, they regulated all the aspects, and because of that there was a bureaucratic complacency. One example of this is an airline called as World Airways. They made a request, and now that is called as a stale request. In the year 1967, this airline wanted to operate from New York to Los Angeles. So, they put in the application to Civil Aviation Board. Now, the Civil Aviation Board has the authority to give permission for airlines to operate on particular routes. Look at what happened. After 6 years, they received a refusal by the Civil Aviation Board. So, the Civil Aviation Board took 6 years to come to a decision about this particular route. So, that is why it is called as a stale request. Okay. Now, in 1973, there was a global oil crisis, and the main reason for that is the Arab-Israeli war. This led to the creation of the OPEC countries, oil and petroleum export countries. These countries, they increased the price of the oil by a large amount, and that led to a crisis in the industry and therefore the Civil Aviation Board was given the job. The effect of this particular oil crisis was that people could not afford aviation, industry collapsed as a result of that. Okay. So, then the ADA was passed in 1978. CABs had two specific tasks. One was safety, which was ensured by the FAA regulations and policies, and the other one was market forces, which were driving the fares, routes and scheduling. So, who passed ADA? It was Jimmy Carter, the then President of the United States. We credit Jimmy Carter with this particular revolutionary act that liberalized civil aviation. The first chairperson of ADA was Alfred Kahn, and the last chairperson was Dan McKinnon. A quick recall. So, what is ADA? ADA is Airline Deregulation Act. It was passed in 1978. Before that, there was a Civil Aviation Board. The main turning point was because of the oil crisis, and it was passed by the government of Jimmy Carter. What are the goals of ADA? To maintain safety so that unscrupulous elements do not suddenly start operating airlines. Reliance on competition to give a better market force, better prices to the customer. Encouragement to civil aviation so that more and more airlines are able to start business. To avoid the concentration of the industry in a few hands or in few airlines, and to encourage new players to come into the field of civil air transportation. These were the stated goals of ADA. Now, because of ADA, there are many consequences. First of all, the authority to set the fare was removed. Now, after the ADA, fares were determined purely by the market forces. Earlier, the fares were decided by the bureaucrats and fixed and communicated. Now, it was in the hands of the market forces. The stale request and other bureaucratic delays were avoided by expediting the processing requests. The underutilized routes were allowed so that airlines could expand their networks. Earlier, routes were allotted by the Civil Aviation Board to various airlines, and no airline could fly from anywhere to anywhere they wanted unless they got an explicit approval from the CAB. That was removed. New safety standards were now incorporated after the CAB was dismantled, and an agency called as the DOT, the Department of Transport, was set up. The mission of DOT was to deliver the world's leading transportation system, serving the American people and economy through safe, efficient, sustainable and equitable movement of people and goods. And these are the key points which were the driving force behind creation of the Department of Transport. Now, the airlines were categorized after the ADA was passed. Note, it is not that every airline is same. You have major national and regional airlines on the basis of revenues. So, at that time, a regional airline was considered to be an airline which has a US revenue, USD annual revenue between 20 to 100 million. A national airline would be one that has a revenue of between 100 million to 1 billion, and the major airline would have revenues more than 1 billion USD annually. So, these three categories were created and regulations were created for each of these based on their operational strengths. Then the CAB earlier prohibited to introduce new rules, but these new rules were liberalized and the charter trips were permitted. Then there was some merger and acquisitions which were terminated, because all the mutual aid agreements between carriers were terminated. The reason is, one of the examples of mutual aid agreement is that one carrier receives payment from another carrier. Okay. Now, the condition is, if the air carrier does not provide foreign air transportation, then only it was permitted. This is one example. Then there were antitrust immunity between carriers. Okay. CAB could grant antitrust immunity between carriers earlier. So, what is meant by antitrust alliance? An example is that airline market seats on some of its partners' flights could be sold by a particular airline. This is great. It gives travel benefits and lower price to customers, but it is a way of killing competition and not allowing new people to enter the market. So, this was removed, and there was a provision for terminated employees, because many airlines, they start and then they stop because of economic and other considerations, but the employees are without a job. So, there was a provision that terminated employees from an airline would be given priority while hiring by a new airline. And also FAA set up safety standards which are not existent before to cater to certain class of airlines which operate very small aircraft on short routes called as commuter airlines. What are commuter airlines? Basically, most of the passengers in these airlines are commuters or local travelers. Some of them travel from home to work and back by air, and some of them travel to neighboring cities on personal and business travel. For example, you have a short route from San Francisco to Los Angeles, just 45-minute flight. You have Southwest, Delta, Alaska, United Airlines and American Airlines operating on these routes. Then you have San Francisco to Los Angeles, 60 minutes. Again you have Delta, Alaska, US Air and American Airlines. Then you have Burbank to Oakland, 75-minute flight. Then you have, so these are typically commuter routes where are short frequent flights at small regional airports, from there to the hub airports. One of the requirements could be to give connectivity to people who are living at regional locations to the central hub. So, the aircraft which are used by these airlines could be like the CRJ 200 which has 52 seats, or a very popular one is ERJ 145. Even in India, Star Air uses ERJ 145 which is a 50-seater aircraft. Then there are very small unpressurized aircraft like Beechcraft 1900 with 19 seats and Dornier 228 with 19 seats. In fact, Dornier 228 is also built under license in India, and now there is a hydrogen powered version of this aircraft which is already under development. Now, just as a side note, my own PhD research was in the area of commuter and regional airlines. So, just out of interest, I would like to show you the summary of my thesis, which is generalized cost optimization of short haul twin turboprop aircraft, including airport considerations. This was done way back in February 1997, that is when I submitted my thesis, and it is freely available from the Cranfield Keres website. If you can just search for it online, you will be able to find it free of cost. In this particular study, I looked at regional aircraft, commuter aircraft, airports and their operational economics together. So, I would urge you to have a look at this thesis to get more idea about commuter airlines and their issues. Let us move ahead and look at the effects of the Airline Deregulation Act. The effects are both positive and negative. We will first look at the positive impacts of ADA. One very important effect of ADA was that it led to market rationalization which resulted in overall reduced prices because monopolies were hit and barrier to entries were removed, restrictions were lowered. It allowed more and more people to come in the airline business, and therefore, because of market competition, the overall prices were lowered. Here is a graph that shows the variation. So, the fare per passenger, okay, it reduced by about 9% from 1979 to 1994. You can see that it reduced by about 9%, okay, from 100. Initially it went up and then it stabilized and then it reduced. But if you look at from 79 to 2005, the reduction is around 40%. It became to 60% from the original value of 100. Okay. Similarly, for the airlines, the passenger load factor, which is basically the percentage of aircraft seats or cargo which is occupied in any flight, that increased because airlines began operating smaller aircraft like commuters and regionals for traffic or for routes with lesser traffic. Then there were low barriers to entry and exit. Many new airlines entered the market because the market forces are going to affect the fares. So, the competition increased, and because of that many new airlines entered the market, most of them through mergers. So, here is one list of airlines and this is another list of airlines. All these airlines entered the market after the Airline Deregulation Act came into being. After the ADA came into force, airlines started moving towards the hub and spoke networks. Before deregulation, they were indulging mostly in point-to-point traffic such as shown here. But after deregulation, they realized that the more economical way to connect the hubs with the spoke cities is to go for the hub and spoke network. Here is an example of a hub and spoke network where Los Angeles and Denver are two major hubs, and they can connect to so many other small cities and provide connectivity. Okay. Now, let us look quickly at hub and spoke versus point to point. Both of them are transporting passengers from one point to the other, but in hub and spoke, the airline has to develop different banks of arrival flights because all the flights have to arrive at the hub. And then after some time they have to depart to various spoke cities. So, you need to coordinate the routing and the scheduling of the flights from hub to spokes and from spoke to hub. In the hub and spoke model, punctuality is essential because a delay that you have will propagate and it will cause complications downline. In point to point travel, the aircraft stop at different locations because they go from one point to the other point, and while it might be good to bypass the hub in modern scenarios, it leads to higher operating costs for the airline. So, the advantages are that there are economy of scale on connections. So, airlines could operate a large aircraft from one hub to the other hub and fill it with passengers which are supplied from various spokes and who are going to other spokes. Then there are economy of scale at the hubs because they can handle large amount of traffic. There is economy of scope in the use of shared transshipment facilities, but during COVID we realized that the hub and spoke model is on the rise, point to point is on decline, okay. But post COVID there is a re-emergence and growth of hub and spoke is unlikely because people are now wanting to go from one point to the other directly without going through a congested hub if it is possible. The ADA also had some negative impacts. The labor earnings declined by 10% because now the airlines started using the policies and schemes which were not very positive and detrimental to the labor. There was poor labor management and bad service, and there were many strikes as a consequence of this. There was overcrowding at the airports. There were delays at the airport because hub and spoke model generally leads to congestion at the airport. There is a higher risk of terror attacks because for a terrorist, a hub is a very attractive place to attack because at one place there is a concentration of people. Okay. So, there was a very volatile financial performance of airlines, and many airlines have lost money. Collectively, they have lost $60 billion over the years. So, what are the factors that cause poor performance? One is it is a connection with the GDP. Then cut in capacity, scheduling and workforce as a result of the poor performance, reluctance to raise fares because of the market competition. There were demand shocks like 9/11, because of which traffic was hurt for some time and then slowly it recovered. Okay. And then there are exogenous cost factors or drivers like the cost of jet fuel, which is a huge component of an airline's operating cost. So, these factors combined together caused poor performance. So, let us end by presenting to you a research question. So, the ADA has led to positive effects and also negative effects. So, net have the positive effects of ADA outweighed the negative effects, and also the role of the government is continuously debated. Okay. Should there be government intervention in the air traffic and the air transportation system, or should it be just a free market? There are people on both sides of the spectrum and they all have very valid reasons. If you want to really know more about this subject, and if you want to get familiar with the developments of the Airline Deregulation Act, I would suggest you go through a few classical textbooks. The first book that talked about the airline deregulation was by J.R. Miller, which appeared a few years after deregulation in 1978, in 1981. This book also contains the complete text of the Act. Then there is a book by Bailey, Graham and Kaplan, which appeared in 85 about the deregulation of the airlines. There is also a study by Morrison, where he looks at in a chapter, there is a chapter in the Handbook of Transport Strategy, Policy and Institutions by Kenneth Button and David Hensher. These are two very famous researchers in the air transportation sector. They have edited a book, a Handbook of Transport Strategy, Policy and Institutions, and in that there is a chapter by Morrison on the deregulation of the US air transportation and its effects. And finally, there is a book by Morrison and Winston, The Economic Effects of Airline Deregulation. This is a publication of the Brookings Institution. So, for those of you who are interested to get an idea about the Airline Deregulation Act or the repercussions, I would sincerely recommend you to go through these books for educating yourselves. Thank you so much for your attention.